Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Thoughtful Bro live streaming, as always, on A Mighty Blaze on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Welcome, welcome, welcome to everybody. As you know, we're here every Tuesday at 2 to talk about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. And before we get to our fantabulous guest today, a few words about A Mighty Blaze, which is an all-volunteer initiative, in case you didn't know, to help writers reach readers during COVID and beyond in our increasingly virtual world. At A Mighty Blaze, we never are asking for your money. If you want to support us, show a little bit of the love, just give us a like on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, whatever have you. That is how you show us the love. Or if you'd like, you can buy fantastic books like The Latecomer, books which are expertly constructed, complex, bitingly comic, ultimately deeply satisfying, and also written by one of the hottest authors out there working today, Hanff Korelitz. This is the fabulous book cover. The story is amazing. We're going to get into all that. That book and the plot, I read them both in this last week. I don't think I could really read many authors for 900 pages over the course of 5 days, but I did it, and it was a joy. A few more words about the Blaze before we get started. If you want to ask a question to Jean or just get a comment across, we'll pop it up on screen. Please just leave it in the chat and we'll put it on screen, or we'll ask. A little tease for next week. I'll have on novelist and screenwriter David Koepp. Now, David, you might not have heard of him, but he's one of the most successful Hollywood screenwriters in history. He's written such films as Jurassic Park, Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, Carlito's Way, Mission Impossible, and Spider-Man. He's also a novelist, and his latest book is called Aurora. Stephen King called the book impossible to put down, and it's already in development by Catherine Bigelow, who did The Hurt Locker and Zero Dark 30. So that's David Koepp, and that'll be on Thoughtful Bro next week. But speaking of the intersection of Hollywood and literature, on to this week's guest. Hanff Korelitz is a novel and a poet. Her runaway best-selling novel, The Plot, is soon to be adapted into a Hulu show starring Mahershala Ali. Her novel, You Should Have Known, in case you didn't know, was adapted into the hit HBO show The Undoing, starring, of course, Hugh Grant and Nicole Kidman. And among her previous novels, Admission also became a film starring Tina Fey and Paul Rudd. Her latest book, as I said, is called The Latecomer. The New York Times said The Latecomer was a sparkling novel that is a nearly forensic study of family conflict. In a starred review, Publishers Weekly said Korelitz returns with an irresistible dramedy of errors. I have seen it comped in like multiple places across multiple publications to both Jonathan Franzen and Edith Wharton. And Ron Charles, writing in the Washington Post, said Korelitz's skills as a ringmaster are dazzling. So, Jean, thank you for being on the show. This is great.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. That Ron Charles review, I'm still thinking about it. What's so uncanny about it is that he got so many of the references that I had not been entirely public about. I mean, like the obvious ones are the ones that I kind of copped to in the acknowledgments at the end of the book. Fine. But there were other things that I thought only existed in my head, connections that he made. And I don't know what that guy eats for breakfast, but
he's very good
inside my head at all times, but it was uncanny.
I will also say that in the very first sentence of that review, he praised the fertility of your imagination, which I thought was deftly done, given the themes of the book.
Oh, that's great. I saw what you did there. That was it.
It's not me. It's he did it.
Yeah. I never thought of myself as a person with, a fertile imagination. I mean, I'm more of somebody who kind of broods about an idea for a decade or two, and then, wallops it with a few gamma rays of what if, and then you have a novel. I'm, there are writers who are just teeming with ideas, and I'm not one of them. I know I'm not trying to sound as if I haven't written 8 novels. I have actually. I've written more than 8 novels because not all of them were published. But I'm not just bursting at all times with ideas.
Well, Let's use that as a jumping off point to get into like the story of this book, because there is this now like sort of famous story about you and, you know, meeting with your publisher. And I think it's famous for a reason, because it's like, I mean, it's such a wonderful tale of you sort of being at this kind of low point of real kind of artistic crisis and then kind of coming out of it in this incredible way. So I sort of, although you've told that story before, if you wouldn't mind just recapping it, because it does have an ending now, which is the arrival of the latecomer. So
that's right. Now the latecomer is now a meta narrative in that it took a long time to get here. It is in fact the latecomer itself. The gist of it is that my editor left the publisher where we had worked together for 3 books, and I did have a book about to come out when she left, and that book did not fare very well. That was my novel, The Devil and Webster, and because it did so poorly, you know, things didn't look all that good for the book that I was writing, which was called The Latecomer. But I did have this HBO show that was in production. You know, I thought maybe that would help. I was contractually obligated to submit the book there first. And we did, and they rejected it. This is fall of 2019. And the message that came back to me from my agent was not even close. Not even close. And I remember saying to my husband at the time, you know, I do have this big HBO show coming out next year. That's how much they hated this book.
Wow.
I mean, you'd think that.
So almost like with HBO, they would have accepted almost anything.
Exactly. Yeah. But not even close. So then the book went to my editor. I was happy for her to follow her where she had gone, but she also rejected it. But she didn't say not even close, though. She said, it's going to be great, but it's not great yet, and you have to write it again. So I spent the fall of 2019 rewriting the book, and in January of 2020, I turned it in again, and she rejected it again. She said again, you know, it's going to be great, but we're not there yet. You know, there's something that's not working. And I had that sense myself, but I was so exhausted with this book. I mean, it's a big book. It's a complicated book. There seems to be everything in it. It was not a simple thing, this book. And I was so frustrated, and I was out of ideas. And in this meeting, which took place in January of 2020, the second time she was turning it down, some hand of, I don't believe in God, but some hand from above, you know, made me say to her, I have another idea. And
wait, before you go further, like, did you have that idea like before that moment, or?
I'd been thinking, wouldn't it be cool to write about, you know, a washed up writer who, I mean, I'd always loved stories about appropriation and theft and plagiarism and all the forms that bad behavior can take, especially in our world. And, but, you know, first of all, I'm a person who has never taken control of a meeting ever in my life. And suddenly here I am downloading this story kind of, you know, off the cuff. And as I'm telling it, I'm kind of thinking about it, and I'm watching her get excited. And that made me feel good, because I felt so terrible about getting this book turned down again and having really no idea how to fix it. I was out. I was tapped out. And, you know, she's getting more and more excited about the story. And I left that meeting thinking, okay, well, you know, it's not like I have no future as a writer. You know, even if this book doesn't work, I can write that other thing I was just telling her about. And the next day, my agent called me and basically said, what did you do? What did you say? What happened in that meeting? And I said, oh, you know, she turned it down, and we talked about what we should do next. And I had some other idea I told her about. And my agent said to me, you are getting a 2-book contract. And I had walked into that meeting unable to sell 1 book, let alone 2. And the next day I had not only, something I had never had before, a 2-book contract, but I had this gesture of real faith in me, which was so incredibly welcome. And that gesture also came with a very important piece of advice from my editor, which was, why don't you put down this book that is causing you so much distress? You need distance from it. You need a break from it. Why don't you write that other thing you were telling me about? And that is what I did. And when the shutdown happened about 3 weeks later, I felt like I was being fired out of a cannon, because I was very frightened. I was very angry. I had been for months, actually. I had been paying very close attention to what was happening in China, and I was terrified. So although, the experience of lockdown was horrendous and just horrible in all sorts of ways, it created a situation in which I was able to write an entire novel in 4 months, which is not something I recommend to anybody. I actually don't even recommend that you read novels written in 4 months. But everything in our world had conspired to create a situation in which I was able to write the plot.
Yeah.
So that is what I did. And after I finished that, and a couple of months of lying prostrate on the couch, I picked up The Latecomer again, and like the skies opened, and I was able to see not only what the problem was, but how to fix it. And I did. I fixed it, and I had to write it a couple more times, but once I understood what it was that had not worked, it was so joyful to be able to make this book into the book that I had always wanted to write. And it's a very different book from the book that I submitted to her the first time and the second time. But I'm so happy with this book, and so relieved that I wrestled it to the ground, basically.
Okay, so that was like a smorgasbord of things that like I want to dig into. There's so much there. So first,
smorgasbord, but go ahead.
So let's rewind to the greatest meeting with an editor in publishing history. And I guess, so the question to ask there is, for other people out there who might be listening who are trying to write a book, people who are generally curious about the creative process, but definitely people who are trying to write a book, there's this old thing where it's like you always have energy for the project that you're not working on. People always want to kind of be working on their mistress of a book rather than the one they're supposed to be doing.
I never heard that. That's funny.
But but it's like here, this is such a turning point sort of for you as a writer. I mean, like the plot was just so great and just universally praised. And here you were, like, you almost sort of didn't write it, or you might have eventually wrote it, but it just, I guess the question is, could somebody possibly realize what you realized, like it's time to set aside a project and start working on this other thing without going through the great crisis that you went through? Or sort of like it's only because you were in such kind of feeling so lost creatively that you were kind of able to kindly say, forget it, I'm switching lanes?
Well, I'm sure somebody could, but I could not. I always think everybody else is better at everything else. I think that the title of this story really should be why we have editors and why we need editors. Because sometimes, we're just, I don't mean to mix my metaphors here, but we really are wandering around a dark forest, and we lose our way. Mm-hmm. So, you just read the book, so this will mean something to you, but there was a draft of this novel in which the Oppenheimer family was sailing around the world on a boat. Okay. That's how far afield, that's how far I was wandering. So I had really just written myself into an absolute stupor. I needed to step away from the novel, and I was so determined to finish it and get it right that I was really my own worst enemy. But because I trust my editor, and because I knew that she meant to do good for me. I'm sort of weirdly trying to quote a Christmas Carol there, but failing. I trusted her.
Yeah.
And I'm, she's responsible for both of these books existing, really, and certainly in the state that they're in.
And if you could, I mean, there's we'll get into it in a moment when we talk about the latecomer, but like, there are some great twists in the end towards the end of that book, and so I'm just wondering if you can answer this question without giving anything away. But like, I'm just dying to know what was the problem with the book that you realized that you fixed?
I can answer that, actually.
Oh, good.
Well, first of all, the latecomer, as you know, and others may or may not, is about a family, a Brooklyn family called the Oppenheimers. And there are a lot of people in this family. And they are all protagonists in this book. That meant, and they go in very different directions. If somebody's on a spiritual quest, somebody is a right-wing ideologue, somebody is has a secret art collection. There are many directions. And in my zeal to give more or less equal weight to everybody, I had neglected to really ask myself whose story this was. I thought, oh, it's everybody's story. It's the whole family story. It's not. There is one person who kind of rises above the others in terms of perspective. So once I realized whose story it was, I had to confront the sometimes abstract problem, but sometimes very nuts and bolt problem of who was telling the story. And that brought me into all kinds of sleight of hand with regard to narrative voice and narrative tone. I am not a first person writer. I have not attempted to write in first person since college. I'm super happy in my little, lane of third person. So having to leave that, which I do in this book, was not an easy decision, but that was basically it. Whose story is this, and who's telling it? And that became very clear when I came back to the book after writing the plot.
And I would imagine, so I know whose story it is, and once you read the book, it will become clear. But like, I would imagine that had a kind of filtering or like culling kind of function. It just sort of like, because you had the world, you had the characters, you had all the history of this family all built up, just it was going probably in just many different directions. But then when you're like, it's this person's story, it just serves as kind of an editing function on it. Right?
It does. Yeah. It does. And it was almost like a joyful realization, but it's certainly, the skies opened up, the lights went on, the scales fell from my eyes, whatever metaphor you want to use. It was just, not only was it a relief to figure it out, it was an incredibly powerful moment, because it was the moment when I knew I could do it. I knew I could bring this thing in. I could land the plane. The stewardess is landing the plane. So yeah, that was a great day. I mean, it was a great realization, which came with it. Oh, I have to rewrite this 450-page novel again, but it's okay, because I know I can do it.
Right. So one last question on the kind of the story of the story, because it's so fascinating in this case. I guess the question I have is just about, shoot, I lost my train of thought. Oh my gosh.
It's okay.
Okay. All right. Let's move on. I'm sure that will come back to me. I want to move on to kind of what the story is about, in kind of family. It's a family drama, and like in a traditional kind of family drama way. The stakes are, will the family stay together or not? And the quote that is often brought up whenever you get a family drama genre story, and I don't mean to say this is like a genre book. I mean, family genre can kind of encompass almost anything, but in stories which involve families, whether the family stays together is often at stake. But there's the famous Tolstoy quote from Anna Karenina: all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. Yeah. And I just wanted to pause, because I sort of like have always wanted to talk to somebody about this particular quote. And I guess like the way I read that quote and like, why is it so famous? I mean, it's the first sentence of one of the most famous novels ever written, yes. But I just saw, like, my read on it is like, well, the one thing that you can say to yourself if you come from an unhappy family is, well, I may be unhappy, but at least I'm different, you know, at least I'm unique. And so it sort of gives a kind of dignity to being from an unhappy family. Like all those happy people, they're just kind of cookie cutter. But I guess my question to you is just, what's your take on that famous pair of sentences? Is it true, or how do you take it?
Well, the reason I'm smiling is that literally until the last draft of the prologue was written and rewritten throughout the many, many drafts of this book. But really until the very end, the first line of this novel was, happy families, please. I mean, that's it. You can see why I eventually cut the line, but I obviously had that quote very much in mind. And then as the writers in your audience know, it's often that first page, that first chapter that undergoes the most brutal evisceration during, because you're starting out this book, you don't know who these people are, you don't know what they look like, you don't know what they sound like, you don't know what they're doing there. So I often find that I have a kind of false start, and then another false start, and then another false start. And then eventually I start slashing and stuff. But yes, I did start with that sentence. And so obviously those I was engaging with some of those questions myself. You know, what makes the family unhappy? The family in this novel is unusual, perhaps even unprecedented, in that they're a wealthy family and they have in vitro triplets. This is not a novel about infertility, although there is it does go into some of the trials that the family goes through in order to have these triplets. But at the time of their creation, which is early in IVF, back in the 1980s, there was a fourth embryo, which, is put on ice because you don't put 4 embryos into a uterus. You probably don't put 3 that often either, but in this case they do. So there's this 4th embryo, which frankly is the embryo that everybody imagines will be the ultimate child, because this couple has just had, I don't want to say failure, but again and again and again has failed to have a pregnancy, and there's nothing to indicate that this time will be any different. So the hope is placed on this spare, unused embryo rather than on the 3 embryos that go into the mother. But in fact, all 3 of them are born. So these are the triplets, the Oppenheimer triplets. And many, many, many years later, somebody has the bright idea to have this 4th child. So this last child, this latecomer, is born almost a generation after their siblings. So, one hears about this kind of thing, and it doesn't even have to, well, I was going to say it doesn't even have to be an in vitro situation. There are, we all know people who have many years later have another child, and you think, wow, what's that going to be like for that kid? But the 2 questions that I kept thinking about, one was, what has to be going on in a family for that to seem like a good idea? This doesn't seem like a happy family kind of situation to forget about that embryo or not want to have that embryo for 18 years and then say, oh, I know, kids are about to leave for college. I have a good idea. What is happening in that family? That's the first question. The second question is, what will it be like for that kid when they realize the circumstances, the fullness of the circumstances of their creation, and the fact that they basically missed their own family? So those were the 2 questions that really got this plot going. And there is there is an epigraph from, well, it's actually from C.K. Chesterton, Father Brown, but of course, like most people who know this quote, they met it in Brideshead Revisited, in which there's a discussion of somebody letting a soul wander to the ends of the earth and bringing them back with a twitch upon the thread, which in Brideshead Revisited is, has to do with religious faith. But in my version, I think it's really just about family. So the whole question becomes, what has to happen in this really, really fractured family to bring these people together?
Yeah. I was talking to a friend about this book, a friend who came from an unhappy family over the weekend. And, he was saying to me that, part of the satisfaction about reading about families that are unhappy is that when you yourself are from an unhappy family, you never quite get everything laid out on the table for you. You never have like all the information in front of you. There's always like somebody's only giving you half the story, or there's some secret hidden information that you sort of feel like is there, but you don't figure out till many years later. And he says part of the reason why these stories are satisfying is because there's this forensic quality. It's like an autopsy of a family. And I mean, I know that, there are like, I don't want to give too much away, but like, it's not that there's only unhappiness in this family. There's like some very great and interesting things that happen in the book, but I just don't want to give it away. But I will just say that, like, do you feel that part of kind of like what draws people to these stories of really mixed up families like this is that this forensic quality of just kind of seeing like, okay, first there was this traumatic incident and that led to an illness over here, and that led to an infection over here, and that infection led to like the severing of a limb over here, and
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the few universals or near universals that we all have. We all come from a family, happy, unhappy, simple, complicated. For a novelist, family is just the gift that keeps on giving. And you can look at novels from Little Women to Anna Karenina to The World According to Garp, which is a novel I thought about a lot while I was writing The Latecomer. And you can say of all three of those, it's about a family. So I don't like reading novels about car racing. If you said, this novel's about car racing, I'd probably say, well, I'm not interested in car racing. But we're all interested in families because, first of all, because they're endlessly fascinating, but also because, we all have one and we want to see how other people did it. Maybe we want to know that we're more normal than we think we are, or that mom and dad weren't the worst. Or somebody has, just the worst brother in the world, which, an argument could be made for that in this family. But at the end of the day, there's hope even for those worst brothers in the world to bring their humanity to the fore.
Yeah.
I'm so enjoying the nasty comments about one of the triplets who's pretty noxious and foul.
I can guess which one.
Guess which one. Of course, I love that too. Although, I gotta say there are some things he says that I actually agree with. Not that matters, but it's been really interesting. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, characterization is definitely one of your strongest points. And like, I think that, so one of the things that I wanted to have a part of the discussion where I talk about both the plot and the latecomer, because I read them both in the course of 5 days. And I just noticed some similarities. And I think like one of them is this way that you characterize people. I feel like, you tell me, but it feels like often your first instinct is to tease the character and to kind of like bring them down to earth a little bit. And you have this very comic way of introducing characters and poking a little fun at them. But I think it almost always just leads to empathy. I mean, it's like, then after we have a little fun out of the way, you begin more and more to see the humanity of these kind of flawed, very human characters.
Well, thank you. I love that. That's really great to hear. And I'm just thinking while you're saying it that in order for a character to be beyond my empathy, they would have to be so egregious. And in my mind, that means violent.
Yeah.
And I'm probably not going to write that character because I abhor violence, and I can't read books in which incredibly violent things happen, unless it's a Stephen King novel. I have to read that, but I want to read that. But so that's the way, de facto, if they are a character of mine, they are not going to have that. They might be cruel and they might be assholes, but they're not going to eviscerate a kid or anything like that. So, that's something nobody has to worry about finding in a novel of mine. So, they are not beyond the pale. They are not beyond redemption.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find that about all your characters. I just sort of know if you're giving them a hard time and really poking some fun at them, like later there'll be something like at least somewhat redeeming about them. So another thing that I noticed about these two books is there's a preoccupation in both of them with the theme of identity and authenticity. And it's kind of like who has the right to kind of be a certain kind of person? What do we believe about who we are? What do we admit about who we are? What do we believe about other people? There's a theme of like impersonating other people and kind of taking on the culture, and in a few cases the exact personality of somebody else. So I just want to know, like, what's that about? Like, why is this sort of like infinitely interesting to you?
I think actually it probably goes back to my childhood. My mother was a therapist, and she and I share a fascination with liars and fabulists, which is a very American thing. I remember in particular when I was thinking about getting ready to write You Should Have Known, which was the novel that became The Undoing, I almost reverse engineered that novel. I remember asking myself, what is always interesting to me? And it was liars. And when I look back through the novels I'd written, which are very different from one another in many ways, that was one of the few, threads holding them together. Almost all of them featured somebody who was lying about at least one important thing about them, but usually everything. So I am I'm not going to say I've never lied in my life, but I'm bad at it. I don't like to do it. I break into hives, I feel guilty. And I'm constantly fascinated by people who just do it. They don't seem to be that bothered by it. It's been an interesting few years in America.
I bet.
For that. And I don't think you're going to find a novel that I write that is completely devoid of some kind of sociopath. So yeah, I mean, who doesn't like liars?
Yeah, and it is fascinating. It has this effect while reading your books of like making me as the reader pay closer attention, because I'm always just like, like it's sort of like everybody's an unreliable narrator of their own story, or could be. And so there's always that extra layer that I'm looking for. And by the way, I didn't say this at the top of the show, but I had meant to, that like, I really did love reading these two books together. The plot had been like sitting on my TBR list for like so long. And I was like, it was like this like dessert that's like waiting in my fridge. And I'm like, I'm just going to read that like when I really need it, because I know it's going to be good. And it totally was. And then The Latecomer is like sort of more of a like kind of hearty protein dish. It's sort of like what you eat for dinner. And then the plot is like chocolate mousse for dessert. Anyway.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. Wow. Wow, that's great to hear.
Yeah, no, they went well together. But all right, just a few other issues, and then we're going to take some audience questions in a few minutes. But one of just to pick a theme, there's a lot going on in this book in terms of like there's a lot of things that are covered. For example, that one character you mentioned, who's this kind of hardcore right winger, kind of public intellectual. Like that's a whole thread that we could spend 10 minutes talking about. But just a few things that I picked out kind of randomly that were also interesting to me is like Mormonism. So one of the characters like becomes a Mormon, or like very, very much becomes interested in Mormonism, and like, and I know that this is sort of an area of interest for you, and
Oh, yeah.
you've been to something called the Hill Cumorah pageant,
Right.
and I just and so, and I think I've seen you describe yourself as a Jewish atheist, but here you are at this Mormon spectacle, and I just kind of wanted to give you a moment to kind of talk about what that's about.
Weirdly, well, there are many things in this novel that come straight out of my little backpack of things I'm obsessed with.
Right.
Mormon history is one of them, Jewish history, outsider art, antiques, hoarders, love hoarders. But this particular area of interest came out of something that I didn't put in the book, which is theater. I'm a big theater person, and years ago, I was at the revival of Hair in Central Park. Fantastic revival of Hair. And the two main actors, I was reading about them, and one of them had been raised Mennonite and the other had been raised Mormon. And I was just fascinated by this kind of weird factoid. And I'd always meant to kind of investigate Mormon history, but it was on my TBR list, I guess you could say. I started to read about Mormon history, and then I just got more and more obsessed by it. And it folds quite neatly into a general interest in religious faith. I'm not a person of faith. Therefore, religious faith, any kind of faith, is fascinating to me. I'm never going to have it myself. So it's like... it's like something I just kind of forensically want to understand. And the thing that separates the Church of Latter-day Saints from Christianity or Judaism is, as my husband likes to say, the paint isn't dry yet on this religion. And it's an American religion. And therefore, it kind of emerges from the cultural mix of things that are not religious at all, things having to do with Native Americans and manifest destiny and all kinds of things that apply to all of us, even those who aren't part of the religion. So I just got more and more interested in it. And then I started going up to Palmyra in Western New York State for this annual event, which has sadly now been discontinued, called the Hill Cumorah pageant. And the Hill
Why
Cumorah,
was it discontinued?
The church just said that they were going to stop doing it. The last year was supposed to be 2020, and I'm sure it was a very expensive thing to do. And it was mounted on the actual Hill Cumorah, which is where Joseph Smith found the golden plates. So it's the ultimate site-specific kind of outdoor theatrical event, almost like a religious pageant. Well, it is a religious pageant, but think of like those nativity plays that go back hundreds of years in Germany. It was like that, except instead of telling the story of Christ, it's telling the story of the Book of Mormon, in which, of course, Christ also appears. So it was this massive kind of amateur theatrical thing, starring a cast of 600 ordinary people who went up there and then worked on this thing. It was just, from a theatrical point of view, it was absolutely fascinating. And I went to all the Mormon sites, and I've delved as deeply as you can delve without actually entering a kind of conversion avenue, which was never going to happen. And I understand what draws the character in my book towards this experience. Yeah.
Yeah. I do too. And I think I'm like fascinated by Mormonism for a lot of the same reasons you are. And I just, as you were talking, I sort of thought about how you and your husband, who is the poet Paul Muldoon, you guys adapted James Joyce's The Dead for stage. And that was staged in 5 years ago or so. And it struck me as you were talking, like sort of as somebody who is involved in the theater, like to see that, like it's a very different kind of theater that's happening there, even though it's like technically the same thing, which is people play acting out these dramas. What it means to the actors is something entirely different. And I'm wondering how that aspect of it struck you.
Well, amazing. I mean, you're shaking a spear on this enormous stage, and it's a religious experience. But the other weird thing that kind of joins into that is that, well, first of all, there are a lot of Mormon theater people, and that is because there's a lot of theater in the culture. And that is because Brigham Young loved theater.
Oh,
So,
wow.
I mean, the first time I kind of made that connection, I thought, holy cow, it's just all roads just kind of converge here. Yeah, there are great theater companies all over the Mormon world, and there are a lot of actors, like Broadway actors, who grew up in that tradition. So, yeah, it's so. I mean, I remember when the Book of Mormon opened on Broadway, one of the guys in the chorus was a Mormon who had actually done a mission. He was no longer practicing, but I heard him interviewed, and he was like, yeah, I did this. I was in Bolivia or whatever. And yeah, crazy.
Crazy. And then I found those parts of the book and like kind of the arc of that character who kind of goes on this, kind of goes deep into Mormonism. I thought that was just totally fascinating and psychologically compelling. That was a great
I'm
part.
glad to hear that, because I was under a lot of pressure to cut that.
Oh.
Just I said no. I mean, I ended up thinking of it as a kind of a set piece, like in a Victorian novel. I used to love this. You'd be reading some Victorian novel, and suddenly the plot would stop, and everybody would go to the Buckingham Palace and get presented to Queen Victoria. There'd be like a 10-page sequence of just being presented at court, and I am there for that. I mean, I have no problem, putting the plot on the hook and seeing what it was like to be presented to Queen Victoria. No problem.
Well, I mean, I would just say that, on the Mormonism issue, it's like it's just not something that gets treated a lot in the literary arts. I mean, there's stuff here and there, but I just thought it was welcome. I mean, I just feel like I haven't really quite seen this before. So I liked it.
Well, I may be the first in fiction, but and I do cite this book in the acknowledgments. Avi Steinberg, who is a New Yorker writer, wrote a fascinating nonfiction book, sort of a memoir called In Search of the Book of Mormon, in which he goes to many places associated with the Book of Mormon and basically tries to have a spiritual experience in all of them. And I did interview him before I wrote this book, and it's just such a good book. And his theory, which he develops in the book, is that the Book of Mormon is actually the great American novel, and that if only we conceived it like that, we would be sort of free to be very respectful of what Joseph Smith accomplished.
That is a fascinating point of view. I'm going to think about that. Yeah, I mean,
that's Avi Steinberg.
Yeah. If nothing else, the history of Mormonism is a wild story.
It is. It sure is. And another thing, we got to leave this, I know, but I mean, to a Jewish person, the ways in which Mormon culture identifies with persecution, with being the subject of persecution, is very striking to a Jewish person, because when you really add up the body count, and I have, I mean, it's something like 12 people. And that's not to say that mean things weren't done. People died in the prairie, and there was cholera, and Joseph Smith got tarred and feathered. But that 12 people includes Joseph Smith and his brother at the end. So, 12 dead people to a Jewish person, it's not that compelling. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You want to talk persecution, we can talk persecution, but it's very important to them, that part of their story.
Yeah, and just sort of being outsiders to the mainstream. I totally get that. I'd never quite thought about that. All right. I had a couple more questions, but I just want to go quick to try a few audience questions if we could, so we can just like pop anything we got up on screen here. Audience Q, what's it like to have your novel turned into a film or TV show, and how involved do you get?
This involved. That's
a zero for people who are watching.
I was completely uninvolved with admission, although they were very kind to me, and there was a kind of very pro-writer vibe on that set, because so many of the people involved in that movie were writers themselves. With You Should Have Known, I was even less involved. It was all David E. Kelly. I had zero input. I didn't even know that the title had been changed from You Should Have Known to The Undoing until I read it on my phone. So there you
go.
Yeah.
Wow. Let me ask you. I had a question of my own in that regard, which is that you've had a number of relatively successful adaptations, and certainly it seems like that's trend is going to continue. You got some great people kind of attached to your work coming up. And then you have also adapted for the stage, The Dead. I mean, clearly, like, going back and forth is something that, you know, you're familiar with. And I'm just wondering, is there something that you feel that, like, there is inherently about your work? I mean, I remember there's this comment. I mean, there's a whole separate story about, you know, going back and how your first book, it was a legal thriller, and you're just like, oh, I just want to I want to write something that sells. And, you know, now you're a genre writer who writes legal thrillers, and you had wanted to be more literary and da-da-da. But here you are, I think, in the best possible way, kind of straddling this genre literary divide, like writing high quality fiction that, like, has hooks and has plot. But I'm just wondering, like, is there something that you feel that there is, like, sort of like inherently about your writing style that makes people want to pick it up and make it into a film?
Well, I don't think it's my style of writing the language itself, because if anything, people complain about that a little bit. They, you know, the people who are used to reading for plot often find my work. My favorite Goodreads review was too many words, way too many words. Okay, got to deal with that. But I think as a reader and writer, I'm always wanting to be surprised. And if you can see, you know, what's coming all the way from the horizon, then I'm not interested in that. I want to be surprised, and that's what I'm always trying to give the reader. It's what I want as a writer. It's what I want as a reader, and what I always try to give as a writer. So I don't think, you know, it's anything inherent to me. It's just, if I'm writing towards a resolution that isn't going to surprise or satisfy anyone, I have to find something better.
Do you still feel in any way? Do you struggle in any way with, like, I don't think you'd really be called a genre writer now, but do you ever think about that?
Oh, I obsessed about it for years.
Yeah.
And then something amazing happened and people stopped caring. I mean, I don't know if they stopped caring in general, but they seem to have stopped caring for me. And this was my number one anxiety about the latecomer, that having finally found some readers, they were all going to say, this, you know, what is this? Where's the body? Not that there's really a body at the outside.
Well,
I thought they were going to sort of turn away and distaste. And I would hear something like, oh, she gets she publishes a thriller and then she thinks she can be arty. I don't know. Obviously, I spent a lot of time thinking of awful things that people might say about me, but I've been so encouraged by people's willingness to come along on this. I know it's a big book. I know it can ask a lot of the reader, actually. So the fact that they're hanging in is just great. It makes me so happy.
Oh, and it's so, I, again, don't want to reveal anything, but I would just say that, like, I loved the last 100 pages, and it's just sort of felt like all the checks you wrote got cashed.
Yeah.
It was like boom, boom, boom. There it all was. It's like
all the boxes got ticked.
There you go.
No
So
thread
it felt
left behind.
What's that?
No thread left behind.
No thread left behind. So it did it seemed like that same, I don't know. Clearly there was the same kind of, like, writerly mind at work here. All right, let's get one more question from the audience. All right, I'm 60 pages into, hi Deborah, 60 pages into The Latecomer, loving it. It seems like New York City is also a character in the novel. Thoughts?
Yeah, there's a lot of New York in the book. There's also a lot of Ithaca, New York in the book. It's so funny you should ask that, because just this morning I was looking at apartments downtown. Yes, because I'm a New Yorker and that's what we do. And I had this very involved conversation with my real estate agent about our love for the city and how we will never live anywhere else. I mean, I really love the city, and I mean, one of the reasons I wrote The White Rose after 9/11 was because I I so desperately wanted to go back in time to a time before that had happened. I don't know that it's as much a character in the novel, but it's certainly it's always a powerful thing for me. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. So we're going to wrap there. I just have one more question that I always ask, which is that of every author who comes on the show, which is that, so just imagine, if you will, that there is an ideal reader for the latecomer, somebody who is just receiving this work the way you would have imagined the dream reader receiving it on their very best day. Now, just imagine that this reader has just finished the latecomer and is sitting there looking out their window. Describe for me, in a phrase or even just a word, what is the feeling that this reader is left with?
Oh, well, I still remember the first time I read The World According to Garp, which was a novel that, you know, really was all over the place. It was violent in places. It was tragic in places. It was funny in places. It was absurd. And when it ended, there was just this feeling of total peace, that nothing had been left unsaid. And I really thought of that. I thought of that novel a lot as I was writing this, that just everything was where it should be. And that's what I was going for. And that's what I hope I did. And I guess the word for that is satisfaction.
When I was writing about this in social media before this interview, I was saying, I think I used the word satisfied. And I want to say, not only did I feel that way, but I was deeply uncertain whether I would feel that way very close to the end of the book.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So
and
you on your toes until the very end.
You did. You very much did.
That makes me happy. Okay, well, as long as we get there in the end, that's what matters. But yeah.
Oh my gosh, yeah. It was. I mean,
I don't know if you're out there, but you know, it was a life-altering experience reading that book. And if there's like any chance that somebody can have that feeling from something I write, I will feel satisfied.
Oh, that is beautiful. Well, Jean, thank you so much for coming on the show. This book, as well as the plot, are wonderful, and they make a wonderful literary meal of both dinner and dessert if you want to read them both in the course of 5 days, as I did. Jean, this has been such an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for coming on the show. All right, folks, we'll see you next week with David Koepp. And until then, take care and happy reading.